Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our third webinar of the Town Forest Recreation Planning webinar series. This webinar is part of our Town Forest Recreation Planning Toolkit initiative, an online interactive toolkit that offers everything you need to develop a town forest recreation plan for your community from start to finish. You can learn more about that project and initiative at vtcommunityforestry.org/Town Forest Toolkit. And we'll put a link to that in the chat box for you. My name is Kate Four, and I'm the Community Forestry Specialist with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. We have quite a number of friends from our program in attendance today, but for those of you who are new to us, the UCF team is a collaborative effort between UVM Extension and Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We provide technical, educational, and financial assistance to communities in supporting stewardship of their tree resources. You can learn more about our program at vtcommunityforestry.org. A few logistics before we begin the presentation this morning. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation. There is no video option for participants. However, we do want to hear from you. Please use the question box in the side panel. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. Again, that's vtcommunityforestry.org later today. In addition, my UCF program teammate, Gwen Kozlowski, will be emailing out a link to those who have registered for the webinar at some point later today. At the end of today's webinar, a survey will pop up. Please take a few minutes to share your feedback on the webinar, as well as provide suggestions for future topics. We hope to continue to offer webinar opportunities aligned with your needs. So today's webinar topic is connecting trails with downtown for economic vibrancy. We are delighted to have so many of you on the webinar today. I think there was actually over 100 people signed up. And I think that really highlights the importance as well as the timeliness of today's topic, especially given COVID-19. Our presenter today is Dr. Shannon Rogers, who is a nature-based economic development specialist and associate extension professor at the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. Now, before I hand it over to Shannon, Gwen has a few polls just to get a sense of who you guys are. So Gwen, I'll hand it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. We'll launch our first poll just to see where folks are located. We'll take about 20 seconds or so to launch this poll. I know looking through the registration, we had a lot of folks outside of Vermont signed up for today. All right, another 5 or so seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. We actually had 42% outside of Vermont, a few from the Northeast Kingdom and a few from Southern Vermont, about a quarter in Central Vermont, and a handful from Northwest Vermont. Our next poll, launch this. Thinking of the town that where you live or work in, how close to your town square or village center is the nearest trail? We'll take about 30 seconds or so for this poll as well. Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. We have 37% where the trail goes right through town, 50% which is less than 1 mile, and a few people with less than 3 miles, and a few less than 5, and just a handful more than 5. So a good portion is right through town or less than 1 mile.
Great. Well, thank you, Gwen, and thank you, everybody, for answering those polls. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Shannon. Thanks so much.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Kate and Gwen in the the Town Forest program for this opportunity. Really exciting to be here with you this morning, and thank you for your time. So I'm going to cover a lot as we progress, but I'm happy if there are clarifying questions to have those put in the chat box, and hopefully we have a good chunk of time at the end for substantial Q&A. But so interesting to hear in that poll that many of you live or work in a community that has a trail really close to your, what we would call a downtown or a village center. That was kind of what we were noticing in New Hampshire and was the impetus for this multi-state research that we did on the connection between downtowns and trails. And I just want to acknowledge, I have a lot of collaborators on this project. You know, my colleagues at UNH, Molly Donovan, Casey Porter, and Charlie French. And then at UVM Extension, Lisa Chase, at UConn Extension, Laura Brown, at the University of Kentucky Extension CETIC program, Jia Ku, and at Washington University, Rebecca Sero. And all of this work was supported by a Northeast Regional Center for Rural Development partnership grant. So thank you to all of those folks. But so my work at UNH and my background is looking at how people use and value nature. And so I have training in ecological economics and a lot of background in community engaged research. And what we are seeing as we've moved from a industrial to a more service-based economy in the history specifically of New England, but a lot across the country and world as well, is that we have at the same time seen huge increases in efforts to clean and improve our natural environment through volunteer efforts, watershed groups, stewardship groups, and also significant legislation that has led to us to, you know, really be able to appreciate and utilize our natural assets as such, as an asset that people value for quality of life, in addition to the resources that we get from nature. So I think probably most of you know that recreation is big business. Well, it's getting less recent now, but still our most up-to-date national data show that, you know, recreation is a huge part of our economy. We see, you know, almost $1 trillion in annual consumer spending, supporting a lot of jobs, and actually as an industry growing faster than other portions of the economy. So specifically thinking about trails, and we know that lots of our community forests have trails in them, so that's included as well. There's many benefits that we all, as citizens of our communities, receive from trails. There's absolutely those quality of life benefits. There's recreation, there is that mental wellness, forest bathing, all of those great things that can take place on a trail. But there are business impacts and there are real benefits that groups and, you know, small businesses to large businesses can accrue from thinking about access to trails, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Property values. There is research that shows on well-maintained trails, homes can garner higher prices, about 4 to 10% higher than those that aren't on a trail. And obviously public health and wellness, but even thinking about sustainability and accessibility in lots of different ways. But for folks who don't have access to cars, are there ways that trails can help connect communities and spaces in communities for daily use in parts of daily life? So just a quick little resource that we found really helpful in case you want to dive into more details, but Headwaters Economics actually has a whole database of trail related economic studies. There's more than 130 in this trail library, and that's where a lot of the statistics that we have found come from. So specifically thinking about this broader multi-state effort that we undertook with folks in New England and across the country, we in New Hampshire were noticing, as were our colleagues across New England, that we had a lot of communities, and I sit in our community and economic development team. I work a lot with natural resources, but I'm in economic development. And we had noticed that many of our communities were struggling in their Main Street or needing ideas, you know, for economic vibrancy. had great natural assets. They had trails, they had community forests, they had waterways, which in some ways I consider to be trails as well, and so do other programs. So we did a bunch of research and looked at different programs that were out there. And two big ones that came up were the Kentucky Trail Town program and the Pennsylvania Trail Town program. And we studied those, we spoke with folks who worked there, and then we set up, thanks to our funders' support, a Train the Trainer visit where we actually went to Kentucky and explored their Trail Town program. So what is a Trail Town program? It is really, it's an economic development tool. It's helping communities assess their trail assets, but more importantly, assess their economic components that trail users would visit, would partake in. How do you bring that spending from the trail, or that potential for spending from the trail to the downtown? And in our research, we learned that there's several elements that really need to be in place for a trail town to be successful. So we broke them into these four components: natural, economic, built, and social and leadership. And like most things in economic and community development, the social and leadership we found to be really the most important. After visiting these communities in Kentucky and researching other programs, you really had to have a catalyst, someone to lead the process, also support for the community, and marketing and promotion about the trails, but also what was there for people to do, where they could spend, where they could get some of their daily needs, or some of the discretionary spending that they could use near that trail. And so, like, interesting to see, about 87% of you said that you have a trail near your community or where you work, in very close proximity to that center. And that is something that we found was an element of success. Obviously, you did have to have a trail to be a trail town, but actually having more than one natural feature was a additional benefit. Like if there was a river, or in some cases, as I had said, rivers were considered trails. In Kentucky, we visited a few communities that their main trail was a river trail, which is very cool. And obviously having a community forest, having parks, beaches, other mountains, other caves even, so that when you're attracting someone to visit or someone to come and think about living in your community, there's many amenities to keep them there. But the other pieces, economic and built, we found were quite important as well. If you have a wonderful trail, but there's nowhere for someone to go and get, a coffee or a beer afterwards, or food, or if you don't have, a restaurant or somewhere where people could stay overnight, then you are not capturing all of that economic potential. And the built setup of the environment is really key as well. Although we initially thought that you would have to have a trail within walking distance to the downtown to really be able to leverage those dollars, but that wasn't the case. We found, especially in Kentucky, when folks were putting together their trail town packages, some of the communities had a trail that was about 3 to 5 miles from any kind of commercial center. And people were more than willing to hop in the car and drive as long as they knew where that was. So signage and marketing and wayfinding were huge pieces. You can be at a trail and think that you're in the middle of nowhere, but really be, very close to a main street or a downtown. And the only way you might know is if you had done the research prior, or having good signage and wayfinding at that trail, and vice versa in the downtown area, having clear signage and an information campaign that shared with folks where those trails were in proximity to where you were, and how do you get there. So we, in addition to those broad categories, we had narrowed down into these assessment characteristics that are really crucial to looking at whether your community might be ready. I just want to explain too a little bit about the name Downtowns and Trails. There were other town programs out there, and their names were copyrighted, and we wanted to make sure that we set some of our work apart. Also, the focus with Downtowns first really emphasizes kind of the economic development approach to this, that having a lot of attention placed on, is your downtown or is your village center ready to welcome people from trails and provide them something of value. So, here's just a list of the critical points that when we work with communities, we begin assessing. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but some of those things that we talked about, I just want to highlight a few key things. These up here are some critical areas to assess. Not necessarily the trail. Obviously, having a trail is important, but we found that trailhead piece was critical. Is it well marked, like I talked about? Is there a kiosk? Is there information? We have found in a lot of our work that public restrooms are very key to these nature-based economic development, because people are not going to be able to stay in your community too long if there's not a public restroom. And actually, the USDA does provide funding for communities who are building, who would like to, build public restrooms in terms of their economic development. So interesting tidbit there. But, if you want to be able to have folks stay longer and thus spend more, overnight accommodations are really key. And it doesn't necessarily have to be traditional hotels. Airbnb can also be a component of that. I know there's challenges in different communities with the level of readiness for that, and we can talk about all this too as it relates to COVID-19 right now, but there additionally needs to be some sort of pathway, as I was just talking about. It doesn't necessarily need to be walking distance, but some way of getting from the trail to the downtown and vice versa. And really, communities need to assess their businesses. We've found that there are certain types of businesses that trail users are looking for. Those include casual restaurants, coffee shops, drugstores, depending on the type of trail, maybe a bike shop or a gear shop, grocery stores, local shops, bookstores, or local artisan shops are around that trail users in particular are drawn to. So the rest of these are additionally very important. I'm not going to go over every single one. I do want to point out that in all of our work on nature economy at UNH Extension is really focused on inclusivity, and we know that nature hasn't always been a welcoming place for everyone, and I'm going to talk more about that towards the end of this presentation, but this has been a tenet of our work, and it is even more important now, given all of the important discussions we're having as a country. So, all right, I'm taking you now just to a little focused case study here in New Hampshire of how we have implemented this Downtowns and Trails work. Just to give you some background, New Hampshire does have a good amount of trails, nothing like Vermont, but we do take pride in the ones that we have, and we have some state-owned rail trails as well as quite a bit of snowmobiling. We have a lot of volunteer organizations, and we have been in particular thinking about this idea of really broadening that definition of trail. So when I started doing this work, and I mentioned, oh yeah, we're thinking about how do you connect trails with economic vibrancy as an economic development tool, people had in their minds, oh, so you mean like 4,000 footers in the White Mountains? And yeah, those are great, but really what we're focused in on is some of those more accessible, closer to town trails. They may not be a whole day outing. They may only be a half an hour or an hour walk, but things like river walks, community trails, historic pathways are something to keep in mind as well. So, not thinking that you have to traditionally be in a gateway community to a very big hiking or mountain biking area. Those are great, but I think many communities have the potential to utilize some of their trails when we have a very broad definition of trails. And the idea also with these downtown or in-town trails is that, you're really close to those Main Street businesses, and it also provides another reason for people to come in and patronize your businesses. Say you wanted to go for lunch, but you had a little extra time and you would have liked, you know, to be able to get out and stretch your legs and see a little bit more of the community. So like a river walk for 30 minutes after lunch is a great complement and maybe more of an incentive to choose one town over another to patronize. And so some examples of that in New Hampshire, I don't know if folks are familiar with Laconia. So a kind of community that's had a varied history, industrial, and now kind of, you know, rethinking itself. But we have the first picture, you know, you're right in the heart of the downtown of Laconia. And within less than a 5-minute walk, you are on a rail trail, the WOW Trail, which is named for Winnipesaukee, Opechee, and Winnisquam lakes, because it goes through all of those lakes. And then in another 5 minutes, you are at a public beach, beautiful beach that has a restroom, outhouse, and, you know, really you could go from doing some of your errands, having lunch, to being on the beach in about 10 minutes. And that can be a huge draw for visitors to your community, but also for communities that are looking to attract new residents and new businesses. Imagine marketing to your potential employees that on their lunch hour, they can go to a beach from a trail and really, you know, have that quality of life without sacrificing a lot. So we took all of kind of this research, the multi-state partnership, and in New Hampshire came up with this Downtowns and Trails program. It's an actual program that we run with our communities who are interested. They reach out and, you know, there's a small kind of application process. And we work with them for 6 months to a year, and then even longer in kind of the action phase. But I wanted to go through some of the steps that we did in Bristol, New Hampshire, which is a lake community, but also kind of at the gateway to the White Mountains. We have kind of 5 steps that we do. And traditionally, we're working with an economic development committee, but it doesn't have to be. We are also, in this project, we connected a lot with the conservation-minded volunteers in the community. And typically, it's a partnership between volunteers and community staff. You know, Bristol has about 4,000 people, so not a huge town. There is a town administrator and a few other employees. But we worked mainly with the Economic Development Committee and then a watershed group in the region, the Newfoundland Lakes Region Watershed Group. So at first we started thinking about, you know, we provide some education, and this is a traditional kind of cooperative extension approach of capacity building and teaching in community. We think, you know, we did some trainings and looked at some of those important, you know, opportunities, but also some of the challenges for linking downtowns and trails. Then with those characteristics that I shared, that whole list, we train community volunteers to use a mobile app, so on their phone, and using the Esri collector for our GIS. We put all those characteristics in this collector app, and you go around town. You're not doing an inventory, but you are looking kind of what rises to the top with, and it's similar to if folks are familiar with a first impressions type program, but really they're looking for those characteristics that we've researched and laid out as important for connecting downtowns and trails. And then you get multiple perspectives. So it's crowdsourcing all of that information. We ask folks to take pictures, provide comments, do a rating on all those categories. So for businesses, they tell us if they think it's a business that a trail user might frequent. You know, other aspects like lighting and benches and accessibility, all of those things come up. Then we launch into gathering additional data in this step 3 here, where we train the volunteers to complete interviews with businesses and residents and community leaders. So those are longer discussions with what we call kind of our key informants. And then we work with the community to develop and implement an intercept survey for folks using trails to determine kind of their interest in their use of the downtown. And then we bring all that information together in an accessible report, but most importantly, we hold a community forum where there is discussion and folks look at the data, but really think about what could they do with it? What are the actions they could take? So again, here are those assessment characteristics that we look at as part of this whole process. And just showing some examples of Bristol. This is their little village square. They have a bike path that we looked at that really you wouldn't know it's a bike path or at that time. It did have some issues in terms of the infrastructure and whether it, here you see it's uneven. Folks felt that that was a little bit unsafe, but they have some nice pieces of infrastructure in place for connecting this bike path all the way down to the Newfound Lake. And along the way and in the downtown, there are some benefits and characteristics that folks notice, such as the greenery. There is actually a downtown decorating committee. Along the way is the library, and as in many small communities, the library is a hub of activity. They actually provide resources for visitors to the community in terms of what to do, where to go. They're very connected in terms of economic development work as well. And they have a restroom, so key to think about. And just to show you some of the results from the surveys that took place, we collected them at the 3 different locations in the village center, at the farmer's market, and then at the foot of the lake where a town beach is. So we had, some interesting responses, and like a lot of communities, there are residents who are seasonal and residents who are year-round. So we had almost a little over 100 people in total complete the survey. But one thing we've added to it, not to do a full economic impact study, but to really give a little snapshot of what people are spending and where they're spending it in the community. We asked folks for a spending profile if they could remember it, and just looking at what they were doing and where, if they were visiting from New Hampshire versus being outside of New Hampshire, where those spending patterns fell out. So interesting to see not so much the magnitude, but really kind of how it's distributed. There are definitely some good restaurants, and then over time more have come in. There is actually not a lot of overnight accommodation. Traditionally, there are long-term rentals that folks can take part in. There is one inn, several very cute gift shops, and other, recreation, several breweries. But there was a lot of work to be done. Folks commented on, and the important part about this is having volunteers who live in the community and are connected with it do the assessment, because it really helps them see it from maybe a different perspective than they had in the past. And it's not us as outsiders coming in and telling them what's good or not. So, seeing some maybe improvements needed in signage, because there is a great historic district and many folks didn't notice that. A trailhead, again, this is part of that bike path, and the trailhead, there was something here, the information there wasn't as easily accessible as it is now. I'll show you some updates. And then the infrastructure for the actual path is a long-term plan. But this is that same, this has turned into this, a really awesome partnership with the town, and then this Newfound Lake Region Watershed Association. So very welcoming, lots of great information now at this kind of trailhead and kiosk. And, some additional pieces of work going on in Bristol. We can't take full credit for them, but they have undertaken a significant signage and wayfinding process to really make it more clear where things are in the community. That was something that came up. Folks were like, I'm actually on the bike path. I didn't even know this was a bike path. And oh, I'm really close to the downtown. I didn't know that. Or I'm actually on the way to the lake. I didn't realize that either. So some signage and wayfinding is underway. And then in the midst of COVID-19, a group in Bristol has come together to really put all of their downtown businesses on one website with updates about, you know, what they're doing, whether it's takeout, delivery, now as things are opening up, and, you know, just keeping people up to date, because communication came out at our final forum with this community, as it does in a lot, as being one of the most important things that they wanted to work on. There were different groups doing different websites and Facebook pages and all these things. So trying to be a little bit more coordinated so that there was a one-stop shop. We did have several interesting attendees at the community forum, and many folks said that they felt like they wanted to be better ambassadors for their community. They wanted to know more about what to tell people when they come and visit, tell them, because they ask, you know, they ask the public safety workers what to do, where to go. So having everybody kind of get more information is something that's underway in Bristol. So some folks also may be familiar with this community, because there was a huge New York Times article, a front page article about Bristol, New Hampshire recently, and thinking about COVID-19 and how it impacts small town America. And Bristol was the case study that they used. And in speaking with folks there, you know, while some of them, they actually were a little concerned with how Bristol was portrayed in that article, in that it made it seem that things were really bad. And it is, you know, it is a seasonal community. There are a lot of visitors and residents who are part-time, but there are many people who live there year-round and who take a lot of pride in the community work they do, and that there were a lot of good volunteer stories and folks coming together that they felt weren't represented in that article. So I just wanted to share that, you know, while we can all think about our small town communities and what they're going through. And that helps transition to, you know, just a little part that I wanted to add that I think is extremely important. How do we think about all of this work in the light of a global pandemic, and how does that impact, you know, our recreation economy? What can we do to support communities? So here is just a sampling of some headlines over the past 3 months from New Hampshire that I put together. Thinking about, I know lots of us have probably seen increases on our trails and people just needing to be outside, wanting to be outside, really appreciating that we have spaces to be. You know, lots of calls to hike locally, to stay more locally, to avoid crowding. In the White Mountains, we've kind of gone back and forth. We've had some trailheads, you know, having to close because of, you know, concern for the crowds and the virus. Really thinking about how do we be equitable in our response for all types of issues related to COVID-19. And then kind of thinking about these communities that are often welcoming people, whether they be visitors or part-time residents. In April, there was some coverage of communities kind of feeling concerned about, you know, visitors from places that were more hotspots for the virus coming to either their second homes or their families' homes, and kind of hunkering down. And what does that do to the community? Some recent research from UNH has found that also areas with seasonal homes have been hit harder by COVID. But there has been some national research on that as well. You know, while we are seeing increases in trail use, in New Hampshire, we don't have a good system yet. We're working on it, of tracking trail usage. I know colleagues in Connecticut have been seeing, with the Connecticut Trail Census Program, have been seeing large increases in trail use. There are some, a rail trail group did a study looking at some other challenges that these trails were facing, you know, loss of contracts, loss of volunteer hours, projects or events being postponed or canceled, and then just, yeah, that kind of challenge of the overcrowding, but trying to educate and provide guidance. And so here's a recent picture from Kentucky, where they've set up a sanitizing station to thinking about health and wellness. How do we play a role in that on the trail? But again, with downtowns and trails, how are our downtowns doing? And what can we do to support communities now? You know, in New Hampshire, the unemployment rate is around 16%, really devastating because we were at a historic low, like many places. And just yesterday, our stay-at-home guidance expired, but you know, we have seen businesses close. We've seen businesses are, you know, working on different strategies. And even though things are opening back up, we are seeing folks, you know, consumer confidence is an issue. Do people feel safe going and being in our communities? So really wanting to think about how now can we support these connections between downtowns and trails, thinking about our current situation in terms of the pandemic. One kind of resource that this great website Trail Finder has done in Maine is added something called Trailside Services, which they have had in place for a few years. But really, if you're looking for a trail and you want to know what's around, this is your go-to place. Right now, because of COVID-19, they are offering for businesses as an economic development tool, free posting. Typically, there is a fee, very reasonable. I think it's under $300 a year, but they've waived that. They're calling it Pay It Forward Maine, but we are working on launching that in New Hampshire and Vermont as well through that Trail Finder program. And one of my colleagues, Emma Tutine, and I are working on that. So it's very exciting, and we really want to help support local businesses in this way and make those connections. And then just as importantly, thinking about what I said in the beginning, how do we make sure we are being inclusive, that we are being more thoughtful in what we do in terms of not excluding people from nature. And so this is something it's a couple years old, but Trust for Public Land has put together an initiative that everyone in the US should have a park within a 10-minute walk of home. So thinking about that as one option, or sorry, one example. But I did want to share that we recently had our National Community Development Conference, which we were supposed to host in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we've been working on it for almost 2 years. We had to take it virtual due to the pandemic, but our keynote speaker was Professor Julian Egeman, and he is a professor at Tufts University, and he focuses on what's called just sustainabilities, and that's the intentional integration of social justice and sustainability. And it's very important to think about that now, always and now, given what is going on in our country, in trying to be more thoughtful about how we plan, how we build, how we include people. And he really, in his keynote to us, focused on this idea of who's allowed to belong in a community or in a city, and that the belonging in it really impacts what it becomes. So we at Extension are committed to even being more thoughtful about this and making sure that we recruit volunteers and are more representative in our work. There are some other resources I just shared here. Outdoor Afro is another organization that connects social justice and nature. And then just, you know, some good literature if you wanted to read more. This is Resources, which is the Resources for the Future in Environmental Economics think tank, and they do a publication. This is from 2019, but it's relevant. You know, looking at diversity in the great outdoors. Is everyone welcome in America's parks and public lands? So I really encourage folks to, you know, if you want more information, to reach out or to be thinking about. Dr. Egeman has a lot of great books and papers on this work, and is really a thought leader now, thinking about, especially from his background in planning and policy, in this intentional integration of social justice. So one other piece I wanted to share too, and I alluded to it in that national study that was looking at how trail groups are doing. We do at UNH Extension have a program called Nature Groupie, which connects outdoor volunteers in New England with stewardship opportunities. And we've found too that in these communities that are trying to connect their trails with their downtowns, that having volunteers to maintain the trails is always something that needs to be considered and maintained. So this is a great resource for that. And I think that was all I wanted to share at this point, although I'm happy to take questions. I think we're going to have a good amount of time for that. And I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you. And if I don't get to your question, please feel free to reach out, or if we can provide any additional resources. I've also shared our website here, and I do occasionally tweet hopefully interesting things or things that I've found in terms of research. I really like Twitter for finding out about new research. So I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shannon, for a wonderful presentation and for sharing so much information. I tried to start capturing some of the resources that you had mentioned in the chat box. I didn't get all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but Gwen and I will follow up with an email and when we send out the recording with more resources that you mentioned and links to those. So thank you so much. And we do have a few questions that have come in, and I'll go ahead and jump right into them and use this as a chance to just remind people that there is a question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. And so please, we do have some time left, so please don't hesitate to send in a question or two. The first question is from Jennifer. She says, hello, and thank you for this great webinar. Do you have any suggestions about how we can track the success of these programs? Did you have a baseline analysis for the program?
Oh, great question, Jennifer. Thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like you might be familiar with Extension, or that we do like to do evaluation. And so the program is about a year old. We have run it in Bristol, and we are running it in Ossipee, New Hampshire as well. I have a long list of folks or communities that are interested to just capacity. You know, we are a very small team, so trying to figure out what we can do in terms of that. But we have an evaluation survey that we use with our community volunteers at the end of the program, but we also track indicators over time to really see how things are going. So for example, in Bristol, that wayfinding campaign that they've put together, you know, we followed the fact that they put out an RFP for looking for you know, a contractor who could help them with that. And now that they've gone to the point of getting some mock-up designs of actual signs that they'll put up in the town, and they're about to put them up. So those are kind of things that we track. I know they're not like traditional indicators, but we also do track, I guess another example, in Bristol, they've been very successful at getting grant funding over the past 10 years. And they do have a USDA grant that is looking at the connection between recreation economy and arts, which is quite interesting. We track that as well. We don't take full credit for all these, you know, recognizing that I'm sure some things are in the pipeline, but we do, you know, go back and evaluate through surveys and through interviews and just staying in close contact. We have these action committees that have resulted as well from the work, and there are 2 of them, and so we regularly check back in with them and provide support as needed. Definitely, you know, things recently have been a little crazy for everybody, especially in small towns. So it's been harder to stay connected in the last 3 months or so, although we have gotten good information about that website that they've put together to support businesses during the pandemic, and those sorts of things. But really, a lot of different types of qualitative and quantitative indicators, whether it be total grants or just these stories of the but for, if, you know, but for the Downtowns and Trails program, I don't think we would have thought of this, and now we're doing XYZ. So I don't know if that helps, but in other communities and programs, we did notice, so in Kentucky, there's actually quite an extensive record keeping process. Their program, I should have mentioned, is actually run through their tourism office. That's not an option that we necessarily have in New Hampshire. Our tourism office is fairly small and focused, you know, on marketing, but they do in Kentucky, they actually certify the towns, and then they have a renewal every 5 years. And so they were just, when we just visited, they weren't at the 5-year mark of even being in existence yet. So there are different models. I'm happy to follow up via email if I wasn't clear enough there.
Thanks, Shannon. And I did put a link in the chat box to your Trails in Downtown website.
Oh, yes.
Is that a good place for people to
yes.
find some of those reports?
Yes, no,
Great.
thank you, Kate. I definitely should have mentioned that. Yes, we do have a lot of information on our website. You can get to it from this nature economy page, but yes, that's the more specific one. We have a whole report from Bristol, but we also have an info brief about this whole multi-state process with examples from Vermont and Connecticut as well.
Great, thank you so much. And there's quite a few people who are interested in your process for selecting communities. You hit about this a little bit, but can you just share sort of where you are in that and what a community process or selection process might look like?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we do get that question a lot about all types of work we do. So my colleagues and I have several statewide programs that we work on under economic development, whether it be business retention or there's a first impressions program. So yeah, it often starts with just the community reaching out to us. So sending us an email, and typically it needs to come from not just one person, but to show that there is a group, like I mentioned, the Economic Development Committee, or say the Conservation Commission, or a group, that is kind of officially designated or recognized by the community. But then we just, we start talking and thinking about the, kind of where the community is in their process of economic development, and if this might be the right program at the right time for them. We do want to make sure, like I said, that there is buy-in. So we often are talking with the town administrator, or we speak before the select board. And then we do, before we start working, we do sign an official MOU. There is a small fee associated just to cover some of the costs, not all of them by any means, a very small percentage, because we are not, fully funded by other entities for our work. But yeah, that is kind of what we're doing right now in terms of that beginning that application process. In terms of these couple communities that we've started with, we chose them because they had reached out, but also there were some other things going on related to economic development in their community and work that had been taking place and showing an interest in this nature economy, recreation economy work. So.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And so I guess, a follow-up question, again, it seems like a lot of folks are very interested in some of the materials that have come out of this process. Specifically, Julie is interested in, is the 18 characteristics audit document available? And then we have another comment from Alec looking to see if any of the materials are public from the Trails in Downtowns program.
Yeah, no, thank you for those questions. Okay, yes, the downtowns in Trails characteristics are in an info brief that we have, and happy for folks to use those as long as that info brief is cited. We did formally disclose the program through our University Innovation Office, which we're often encouraged to do when we're kind of creating new creative works. So just, citing that, where you got it from is super helpful. In terms of the collector component, the technical component that's on the, we can do it on an iPad or a smartphone. That part we can't just give to folks. We have been able to do it, through the program, but for certain reasons, which I'm not super clear on, we can't just make a copy of it and give it to people to go and do on their own. And we don't really advise just doing that piece. I mean, it's definitely a great way to start and think about it, but really the program is meant as a package in that you're bringing together spatial, quantitative, and qualitative information to look at this bigger process. But yes, all those characteristics are listed in our brief about Downtowns and Trails, which is on the webpage, but I'll also make sure that direct link goes out in the email.
Great, and Shannon, I just put a link in the chat
Oh,
box as
great.
well for folks.
Sorry, I can't see the chat box. Thank you so much.
No,
Perfect.
that's okay. Just letting folks know that if they want to check it out before the end of the call today, that the link is there for you. A few more questions here. One from Kara: is public transportation ever taken into account in the matrix?
Yeah, that's a good point. And sorry, I didn't go over every single component of that, but let's scroll back. I don't know if you can still see this. Scroll back to those characteristics, and you will see that streets and transportation are a huge component of that, thinking about kind of all aspects of that. Bikes did come up a lot because a lot of these trails that we researched were either rail trails or you could use your bike on them. So bicycle related infrastructure, but buses, cars, taxis, rideshare, all of those things. And even when you're thinking about having folks, visitors from very far away, air travel is an important thing to think about as well. I know all that's kind of different now these days. But yeah, definitely having some source of transport. Like I said, when those trails are not within easy walking distance, or if you're not able to walk, or if the accessibility maybe by as the crow flies, they are only a mile from your downtown, but it's like a kind of a challenging way to navigate, or you don't feel safe walking, having buses, and in some places, if there's good subway or rail system is important as well, for sure.
Great. Another question, Shannon, from Deb, wondering about how important is it to create a trail that is ADA accessible, and are you aware of any type of funding to help support the infrastructure improvements?
Oh, that's a really important question. Yeah, I think definitely it is important to think about. And I personally don't know funding, but if you email me, I have a colleague who would definitely know. I just don't know off the top of my head. So, and I wanted to make an important distinction because we often have communities reach out to us and say, well, we really want to build a trail. Can you help us build a trail? And there are lots of people who are good at that. That's not us. We are more about that economic development component. And we really, I guess that goes back to the selection criteria for communities. We really want them to either have a trail, or in the case of Ossipee, they have a former rail trail bed that, there's already existing infrastructure. In that case, they may decide to work on it with their program. They're really trying to assess whether they have that economic infrastructure to even support visitors. So it is really more about the downtown piece. Like I said, that's why we put that word first, but definitely, that's a huge consideration when you're doing this assessment too, thinking about who can use the trail and how accessible it is. And of course, that is, I think, a goal for a lot of our communities, to have them be as accessible as possible, recognizing, right, that there is that big kind of financial commitment if you are starting fresh and trying to build a new trail. We have thought about with communities, how do you make that pathway, like I was just speaking about, from the trailhead to the downtown entrance more accessible. And that is something that some communities are thinking about as well. So in the case of Bristol, where part of their trail was that bike path that needed some work, they're working closely with the Department of Transportation on the 10-year planning at the state level because it's a state road, for upgrades to that to make it more accessible. But yeah, great question about that. And I can connect you with folks who know more about funding opportunities for ADA compliance on trails.
Great, thanks. And a comment and a question from Lisa. She says, again, thanks for an excellent presentation. We're launching a farm walk program in Vermont. This idea is a response to, to increase demand for outdoor recreation and limits on farm experiences due to COVID-19. I can see a lot of lessons from the downtown and trails program that would be relevant. Are you or others in New Hampshire working on anything similar, any farm walk programs, or can you share some suggestions on on this idea, I guess. I'm sorry, I'm trying to scroll down and I can't see the rest of the question, but I think it's any suggestions related to this new initiative that Lisa is working on.
No, I love that, Lisa. That sounds so awesome. Yes, it's so funny you should say that because like a month ago, someone from Northfield, New Hampshire, which is kind of in the central part of the state, reached out to me and asked about the exact same thing because she had just bought a farm that's very close to a trail, and she would love to have folks ride their bikes or walk to her farm to get their food. And I think you're right, there's so many connections, and it definitely, we don't have that on our list of characteristics. We should definitely add it, I think, because if you have that type of resource on a trail, then it should be highlighted, and I think considered. Sorry, I'm just scrolling to this, the Trail Finder piece. So under the services, this is not live, but if you went to this site, I don't think there are any farms on it yet, but trailside services are very broad. It's not just businesses. There's a couple of Audubon and natural areas listed as well. It's other places that you might visit. And I think that, you know, farms, it makes so much sense. And especially now with all of us more than ever appreciating our local farmers. I love that idea. Yeah, Lisa, follow up with me. I do want to work on it more. But yes, so this woman who reached out to me in Northfield did get connected with, a colleague of mine is actually working on some recreation planning related to their trail systems, and they have a committee that she's now joined. So that wasn't that long ago, but I'm hoping something's going to come out of it and maybe be a case study that we can utilize further in New Hampshire. So that's really cool.
Great. Well, that's a fun kind of exploration in sort of a new spin-off of this work.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. And thank you, Lisa, for that question. And sounds like we can stay tuned maybe for some more work in that area. Let's hear just a few more questions here, Shannon. A question about Kentucky's resources. Are those publicly available? And where might somebody find them?
Yep. That's another link that I can definitely provide. They are publicly available. Some of them are a little tricky to find, but they're, like I said, it is through their tourism office. And interesting that we found in Kentucky, New Hampshire doesn't have, like I said, a lot of resources for our tourism work, but in Kentucky there's a county level tourism tax. So when we visited, that showed up on your receipt for the hotel and such. And so they are able to have kind of really focused county level resources on tourism. And so that's where, some of those materials come. But yes, they are publicly available, and, happy to provide that link in the follow-up.
Great. We'll make sure to pass that along. Let's see here. As I'm looking at the rest of the questions, there was a question in the chat box about nature economy. And so I provided a link in the chat box, but Shannon, do you want to talk a little bit more kind of about this idea of nature economy? It might be new to some folks.
No, thank you for the question. I love talking about this. And yeah, it is new. It's new for us too. And so we started that work to my colleagues, Charlie French and Molly Donovan, prior to my arrival at UNH Extension, had been noticing that a lot of our communities were saying, all right, we really need help with our downtown. We've lost businesses, but look, we have this beautiful lake, or we have these trails, or we have a community forest. How do we put that all together? And so I came, and part of my charge was to work on this area of nature economy, which was a new component of our community and economic development team. And really, it's broadly called nature economy because we do work on recreation, we do work on tourism, but we also work on aspects of community resilience. And some of you may be familiar with the term ecosystem services. So again, as an ecological economist, my training is in thinking about how people use and value nature. And they can value it in lots of different ways monetarily, and that's, we try to figure out what the value of some things that, you know, are challenging to monetize. But they also can do that in terms of the decisions they make and the trade-offs in planning, in community decision making. So we established this area of nature economy, which basically is how do communities benefit from nature. And under that, we do have, like I said, tourism, but we also have a lot of things related to quality of life. And so business location, we've found there is research that shows that quality of life is the highest driver for when someone decides where to locate or start their new business. Looking at even the benefits of green infrastructure, we do some work on that. And you know, what is the value of, say, having a wetland or green space versus having to build a wastewater treatment facility? I've done research on that as well. So it's this kind of broad umbrella for a lot of the work that we do that's at the intersection of nature and the economy, and you know, with the economy being fairly broad. I hope that helps, but we're still working on it every day.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful, and thank you for taking a little bit of time just to explain it a little bit further. And again, in the chat box is a link to the website. I've actually been there myself, and there's a lot of great information. So thank you, Shannon, for pulling that together. And just looking at the time, you know, our hour is up, unfortunately. Although I feel like we could go on. I want to end on one last question from Darren, just wondering about if there's similar technical assistance programs available in Vermont. And I have been scratching my head and trying to think about what resources, you know, we can offer to folks on the call today who are based in Vermont. And I would share, and Shannon, I'd invite you to share resources that you can think of. But I know that my colleague Jessica Savage over at Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, who heads up the recreation program over there, has been thinking about trail towns and some of this type of programming. And so I would suggest she would be a great point of contact. She's also heading up our VORAC work here in Vermont, which stands for the Vermont Outdoor Recreation Economic Collaborative. They're a group of businesses and nonprofits and government agencies all coming together to think about outdoor recreation in Vermont and how to support communities and businesses in making outdoor recreation more accessible. And so if you go, I'll put the link to that group in the chat box as well. They offer grants and funding opportunities, and would also be, I think, another great resource. But those are the two that I can come up with off the top of my head. Shannon, any other thoughts on other resources? Maybe not just for Vermont. I think we might have a few folks from Maine on the call as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I know colleagues at the Northern Forest Center are doing great work in this area. I know Lisa Chase and I had talked about, you know, hoping for in the future, once we get, you know, a few more communities off the ground, maybe having a cross state kind of collaboration, you know, with a couple of communities, especially we know like the upper Connecticut River Valley area, that upper valley area, those folks think of themselves very much as a region and not necessarily in New Hampshire versus Vermont. And then there are definitely some funders. You know, I think that would be something to, we're always, you know, we do have to do grant writing for our work, but oftentimes putting together a multi-state or thinking about collaborations can be really great for things like USDA or Northern Borders Regional Commission. Yeah, I'll keep thinking of more, but those are the ones that come to the top of my head right now.
Great, thank you for those additions. And I did put a link in, Stephen in the chat box offered the suggestion of the Trails and Conservation Assistance Program out of the Vermont National Park Service region. And looks like Jennifer Waite Rivers is the contact there. So I've put the website in the chat box for folks to check out more information on. Great. Well, thank you again, Shannon, for taking the time to join us and sharing your excellent work in this topic. Clearly, you know, it's such an area of interest, and I think there's so many connections both with our downtowns and thinking about trails and the connection to town forests, as well as Lisa mentioned, farms. It's really exciting to hear what you've been working on, and it sounds like we'll have to have you back because the topic continues to expand as you know, the connection between our local economies and outdoor recreation continues to grow. So thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today, and thank you everybody for taking some time out of your day to join us to explore this topic further. And please, for those folks who are on today, we do have another webinar coming up next week on trail design and trail building. So I know Gwen will include more information about that in the email that goes out after the webinar today. In addition, she'll be sending the link, and it sounds like a whole lot of resources. So it might take us a little bit of time to put the email together. So if you don't see it, you know, early afternoon, we'll do our best to get it to you by the end of the workday tomorrow. So thank you again, Shannon, for taking the time to join us today and sharing all of this great work that you guys have been on. And looks like we have lots of collaboration ahead of us. So
absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Gwen, and thanks for all the great questions, everyone. I appreciate it. Looking forward to hearing from you.
great. Thanks so much, everybody. And with that, I'll end the webinar today and remind you there's also going to be a pop-up survey at the end. So please take a few minutes to provide us with a little bit of feedback on the topic today, and also use that as a place to share other topics that you might wish to explore. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and hope everybody has a great day. Be well.